So we need to look at military spending simply the price of that foreign policy. If you want to subsidize every industrialized country, be allies with everybody, underwrite prosperous allies here and there, go nation building, if you want to engage in this kind of policy, it's going to be expensive. Because it means you need troops for Europe and you need troops for Asia, you need troops for the Middle East. You need carrier groups, you need marine, expeditionary forces. You need these sort of assets. And the price today is very high. The U.S. accounts for roughly half of all military spending on Earth. U.S. military spending, around $700 billion a year, depends exactly what you throw into the package. But American military spending, if you adjust it for inflation, we now spend more on the military than at any point during the Cold War, the Vietnam War, or the Korean War. It's an extraordinary amount of money. There is nobody on Earth who comes anywhere close to us. I mean, we are a world ahead. A world ahead. In terms of our capabilities, the size of our forces, the quality of our manpower, our weapons, we are at a very different level. But it costs. You don't achieve that kind of dominance without spending. And that's a result of the foreign policy. If you want to have this kind of a system, you're going to have to pay for it. So that's cost number one. The second is the risk of war. If you create alliances and draw lines all over the world, you have to be prepared for the risk of war. Now, our hope always is that we deter. You create an alliance with somebody and you say, great, nobody will dare touch them because they're allied with us. The problem is we have a world of history where deterrence fails. I mean, if any of you study World War I, we had alliances there. Both sides are saying, don't touch us. And neither side quite took the other one seriously. Nobody really thought anybody would be stupid enough to go off to war, and lo and behold, Europeans collectively jumped off the cliff, and 16 to 20 million people were dead 4 years later. Suddenly the alliances became transmission belts of war as opposed to fire breaks to war. And the danger with alliances is, if you make promises to defend another country, you hope you're never called on it. But if in fact conflict arises, you're in. I mean, you don't have any choice. The other thing that alliances do is they change the behavior of your friends. Because imagine if you're in the situation where you are president of a small power and you've got superpower behind you. You probably act rather differently. It's kind of the old movie, little kid with his big brother behind him, suddenly, I can be really tough here because I've got some muscle behind me. And that's what we see in countries, I would argue, like from Taiwan to the country of Georgia, is you find them willing to act more irresponsibly when they believe the United States will back them up. 2 years ago, there was war in the country of Georgia and Russia. I think there's very good evidence to believe that Mikhail Saakashvili, the president of Georgia, really believed the U.S. is quite willing to back him up. I think the evidence is quite clear that he started the conflict. Now, the Russians, I think, took advantage. We're quite happy to have it happen. Very manipulative there, so I wouldn't endorse the Russian conduct in any way. But the people who started, the first shots were fired by the Georgians, and I think the evidence is that Saakashvili thought he had America behind him. That he really thought we were willing to face down the Russians. So there's a danger. You set out these kind of alliances, you have risks that come with that. We think of North Korea, think of Iran, all of these things. You're having an assertive foreign policy. At the end of that line is a willingness to go to war. Another cost is the loss of life. Now, we've been very lucky. The wars we have been fighting, in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan, are much less costly than other wars we fought. We lost 60,000 people in Vietnam. We lost over 30,000 battle casualties in Korea. Now, we're talking something over 4,000 in Iraq, something over 1,000 in Afghanistan. Now, if you compare casualty levels, the good news is we have had far fewer. On the other hand, the good news is a lot more of our personnel survived. The bad news is a lot of them have very serious injuries. People who would have died in Vietnam live today, but they also have very debilitating injuries. We have about 30 to 40,000 overall casualties. This is a cost of your policy. This is the tip of the spear. I mean, these are the people who are going to carry out any kind of coercive interventionist policy. That has to be part of your calculus. We also have to recognize that Americans are not the only people who die. There's a tendency to want to look at things like Iraq as being a humanitarian venture. The estimate of civilian deaths in Iraq starts at 100,000 people. That's the starting point. There are estimates that climb to 1 million. I think those are probably inflated. They're based on some methodology which are accepted in a lot of other places, but wherever. If we just start at 100,000 people, now the point is Americans didn't kill all those people. However, if you're going into a situation and essentially blowing up a society, and that's the result, you bear responsibility for setting that off. And that has to be in the back of your mind. What happens in Afghanistan, drone attacks, all of these sorts of things, it is inevitable And the US tries to do very well at this. I mean, if you look at targeting today versus targeting in World War II, we no longer do carpet bombing. We don't firebomb cities. You know, I mean, World War II is hideous in terms of Allied policy as well as, you know, the Axis policy. We don't do that today, but even so, innocent people die. So we have to keep that in mind as well. The cost of this kind of foreign policies is not just our casualties, it's the cost of other people. Another cost is the burden on military personnel. We found that dramatically in Iraq, where we're trying to basically maintain an occupation. We basically turned reservists from emergency supplements, I mean, people you bring in if there's a big conflict, to substitutes. You know, we were just kind of bring you in for a couple of years, you get home a little bit, bring you back in. Put an enormous burden on people, especially in the reserves. You know, the point is you're out in the civilian economy and suddenly you've lost your job. Now you're all, you know, it's extraordinary burden. For a while the US found itself having real trouble with recruiting, with retention. Because what you're finding people doing is this isn't what they'd signed up for. There are some, you know, fun signs that you'd see in Iraq of reservists putting in the windows of their trucks saying, you know, one month a year, yeah, right, or 1 weekend a month, yeah, right. I mean, their service had suddenly become active duty, not reserve duty, as they'd expected. There's also a cost on the home front of civil liberties of limited government. Randolph Bourne is a social critic of the 20th century. His comment was that war is the health of the state. Robert Higgs has done a book called Crisis in Leviathan. He looks at the major expansions of government power, of government spending. And those came during wartime. I mean, you know, a huge expansion during the Civil War, World War I, World War II. Now, it recedes after the conflict is over, but never all the way. Never all the way. It's always at a higher level, then it moves ahead. You know, rent control in New York City was an emergency measure in World War II. It is still with us. You know, these things have a tendency to stick around. I mean, the U.S. got into a lot of economic management, particularly in World War I. In many ways, kind of the German system of war socialism was adopted by all the Allied countries, including the U.S., taking over the railroads, all sorts of things, even more heavily in World War II. So war is going to have an impact on your domestic society. Another possible cost, depending upon what you're doing overseas, is going to be conscription. I mean, the problem is if you want to maintain an active personnel, you know, intensive policy abroad, can you do that through a volunteer military? We have done extraordinarily well with our volunteer military. I worked for the man in the White House who basically, under Richard Nixon, brought in the volunteer military. I mean, he's the reason that there is no draft today. His name is Martin Anderson. Nevertheless, there's a lot of fear today. You know, I mean, we got into a problem of some retention and recruiting. I mean, you know, if you're willing to get into small wars, if you're going to have ongoing occupations, these things put extraordinary pressure on your armed forces. Are you prepared then to move to this next step in terms of your society? And another very important cost, I would argue, of foreign policy is terrorism. Now, there are a lot of reasons why people hate us. That's not really the issue. The real issue is why do people hate us enough to try to kill us? And I think it's important to recognize is that terrorism is not unique to America. There were a couple of czars of Russia who were murdered by terrorists. The Archduke of Austro-Hungary, he was the heir apparent, was murdered in 1914. His death, his murder was what set off World War I. He was murdered by Serbian terrorists. I mean, it was a political act against what was seen as the oppressor in the region. You know, the most kind of prolific suicide bombers on earth until Iraq were the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. I mean, they actually had an entire brigade of young people, people under 18. You know, what they did is this is a tactic they used in an ongoing civil war with the majority single leaders. You know, none of this was because they were too free. It was all a political tactic. Robert Pape of the University of I think Chicago has looked at the role, the impact of terrorism. He said, you know, it ties to occupation. It's used as a political tactic. Look at the Moscow bombings recently. The Moscow bombings were carried out by Chechens, women whose husbands had been killed in the conflict. I mean, so the problem is terrorism tends to be a response to policy.